Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. On today's program, we have quite the undertaking, or rather, the Undertaker.
That doesn't make sense.
It will, my friend. It will. Stanley Swan is here to talk about his new book, Tales Unleashed, and will read us a story from it.
So that's pretty neat.
Alberto takes us to Old Mexico with a tale about a haunted ranch house, and we have a science fiction story called Spacemen Never Die. Now, I think you know what I'm going to say next. And yes, it's time for a 5-minute mystery.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by the giraffe. These are some of the most misunderstood animals in the animal kingdom. The giraffe is an African even-toed ungulate mammal, the tallest living terrestrial animal, and the largest ruminant. Lots of cool terms for you guys to look up.
Inspector Craig, I just decided that working for the police department is very ratifying, especially even more so when it gets us free passes to the circus.
The word is gratifying, nimble-brained. To ratify means to put your stamp of approval on something.
So that's what I said. With me, it's very much okay. When I was a kid, I was always crazy to join the circus.
You know, Pepper, sometimes I wonder...
Yeah?
Oh, never mind.
Inspector Craig, I've been looking everywhere for you.
Oh, hello, Denny. Pepper and I want to thank you for the passes. I think the big show is better than ever this year.
I'm afraid I'm not going to be much of a host, Inspector. It seems the snake charmer's been found dead and...
Murder?
It looks like suicide. I'd like you to run over with me and give it a routine check. Sorry to bust in on your fun this way.
Looks like suicide to me, all right, Inspector.
An open and shut case, as far as I'm concerned.
It's so hard to believe. Dorothy.
You own part interest in the circus, don't you, Brian?
That's right, Inspector. Nat Bryan and I are partners. Nat, I can't tell you how sorry I am.
Thanks. How long were you and Mrs. Bryan married?
Not long. I can't believe she'd do a thing like this.
She was the snake charmer, right?
Yes.
Suppose you tell us how it happened, Brian, so we can get the facts straight.
Well, lately, Dorothy and I... Well, that is, there have been disagreements, quarrels.
There was some talk about a trapeze artist, is that it?
Yes. Dorothy was insanely jealous and thought I was interested in a little tightrope walker.
Were you?
No, there never was anyone else for me but Dorothy. And now...
All right, go on.
I came here late this afternoon to get her to listen to reason. She refused to be reasonable. There was quite a scene, and finally she got up and ran into the dressing room.
Yes, I see. These tents are divided into little rooms. It's very clever. You were out here, is that it?
Yes.
And she went into what could be called the other room. All right, go on.
I had no idea what she intended to do. Otherwise, I just can't seem to realize.
We understand.
Of course we do, Nat. Go on.
Well, that's all there is. She shot herself. And I was sitting here all the time. After a while, I got up and left. I was seen coming from this direction by several people. That's why I came and told you this. I didn't want the police to think I was hiding anything.
You did the right thing, of course. This tent is set apart some distance from the others, isn't it?
Yes. No one wanted to be near the snake charmer's tent, in case any of them got loose.
That accounts for no one hearing the shot. There's one thing I don't get. How is it you didn't hear the sound of a gun going off?
I told you it was late afternoon, feeding time for the animals. Dorothy's tent is next to the giraffes. They were making such a racket hollering for their food, I couldn't hear.
Inspector, if I may make so bold as to make a remark here, this guy is, to put it bluntly, an awful liar.
Why, how dare you...
Are you sure?
Plain as the nose on my face.
Well, that's plain enough for me. Hold still, Brian. Don't make a move.
In a moment, Pepper will reveal the clue that led him to believe it was murder, not suicide. But first...
Okay, I think the guy did it, so I agree with Pepper. I thought for sure that the gunshots were the thing, but perhaps the real clue here are the giraffes. Are we sure giraffes really eat? And if they do they really make a racket? Let's head back to see what Pepper has to say about this.
Now, back to our story.
You better explain, Pepper. How do you know he's lying?
Because giraffes is like turtles. They don't make noises. Brother, is he dumb?
Good work, Pepper. Okay, Brian, you're under arrest.
Giraffes don't make noises. Can that really be true? Well, believe it or not, it is partially true. You see, giraffes do have a larynx, but researchers suspect that the reason no one has ever heard giraffe communication is because the length of their neck makes the frequency so low that humans can't hear it. So, Pepper is right. How about that?
What's that you say?
I have to say a big thank you. This past week I was checking on the podcast numbers and found a couple of interesting things. First, that the show is now ranked 79th in the fiction category on Apple Podcasts, United States. That's pretty darn cool. Also, I found some new reviews sent in by you guys that were not only 5 stars, but made some really nice comments about the show. Thank you for that. Leaving reviews and feedback about the show means the world to me. That you would take the time and let me and others know what you think about the podcast is amazing. This has a huge impact on what we do and, more importantly, how we grow. And I thank you for that. Some of the newest reviews were left by IK110317, Inspired Money, Baby Susie Q, and Must Be Jam. Thank you, one and all. And now, this word from Audible. Today's podcast is being brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. They have over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Android, computer, Kindle. Whatever you have, you can listen to Audible on it. So, what am I listening to right now? A Man Called Noon, narrated by Stephen Mendel. This book is a classic Louis L'Amour Western in every sense of the word. In one swift moment, a fall wiped away his memory. All he knew for certain was that someone wants him dead, and that he better find out why. All he has is his name, mad skills with a gun, and a map to $500,000 in buried gold. Was the treasure his? Is he a thief? A killer? He doesn't have any of the answers, but he needs to find them soon. If you've never read a Louis L'Amour novel, then this is a great place for you to start. And you can have this book today. Here's what Audible has set up for us. Audible is offering a free audiobook and 30 days to give you the opportunity to check out their service. To download your free audiobook, go to audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. Again, that's audibletrial.com/Ron's Amazing Stories. And you can get your copy of A Man Called Noon today. Thank you, Audible. And now it's time for your stories.
These are your stories, sent by you, for you.
Our story is a ghostly tale, and it comes from Mexico and Tiagua. Hello, Ron. My name is Alberto Sandoval, and I live in the Central Valley of California. I've been listening to your podcast since it was mentioned on Jim Harold's Campfire. It'd probably be easier for you to do the math. I really enjoy the podcast, and I don't miss an episode. I particularly like the stories based on the Old West and the material related to the Great War. I am writing to share a scary story that happened to my mother in Old Mexico. Although there are podcasts dedicated to the paranormal, such as Campfire, and many others that I subscribe to, the reason I want to share this on your podcast is to add to the ever-increasing number of storytellers on your show that share these interesting experiences. I would like to keep the ball rolling, and I hope others join in as well. Alberto. Well, Alberto, I quite agree with you on that score. I've been on Jim's show a number of times through the years, so I too can only guess how long you've been listening. I do thank you for your story, and I hope everyone enjoys it as much as I did. Here is Alberto's tale. It was my mother's stories about her experiences that got me into the paranormal in the first place. My interest grew by hearing other people tell similar stories on this oh-so-interesting subject. My mother told many stories to us, her children. They ranged from the infamous La Llorona to disembodied baby cries, as well as witnessing a floating ball of light the size of a basketball, which seemed to float around in an errant manner. What makes these stories scary are the settings where they took place. Places like old homesteads that lacked running water and lighting made for very dark nights that added to the horror of it all. Moonlit nights didn't fare much better, even if they improved one's ability to see. It only served to play with your imagination. A bush or natural formation of any sort took on a scary aspect and made it appear as if there's always something sinister in those shadows waiting to pounce on you. Well, here is my mother's story, which I have titled Haunted Home in Old Mexico. This account takes place in the summer months of 1962. The setting is a rural ranch house in central Mexico. This was a point in time where this particular area in Mexico did not have access to common utilities such as electricity or running water. The moonless nights made for a very dark setting, and the lack of neighbors meant for a desolate and an eerie panorama on any given night. My parents were born and raised in the area, and they both have had paranormal experiences. My father once saw a haunting scene where a man was killed by federal troops during the Mexican Revolution, retracing his final steps just before he was shot to death. My mother had many stories of her own, from hearing disembodied baby cries coming from a corral to the accounts of wailing heard by all her family, said to be that of La Llorona. In this story, my mother and father were recently married, and my eldest brother was only a few months old. My parents were young and searching for a home with some land that they could live on and farm. My uncle informed them that another uncle had been living in a house with his family and was moving. My parents would be welcome to stay there if they wished. Later, they found out that the reason they were leaving the place was a female cousin was being tormented by apparitions and paranormal happenings. It was said that my mother's cousin was so traumatized by the activity that she was a shell of her former self. She was pale, skinny, and wasn't eating. Fear of losing their daughter, her parents finally decided to leave the house out of desperation. My parents agreed to move in. Almost immediately, they began hearing strange noises in the house. At night, they would hear a scratching and banging throughout. My mother was scared, and my father didn't want to show fear, so he chose to ignore the activity. On one occasion, the noises were so bad that my father decided to investigate, after my mother's insistence that something was wrong. The noise was coming from the room above them. Most houses in the area built these rooms as warehouses to store grain and equipment. My father insisted that it was rodents or some other animal that had dropped something onto the floor. He went upstairs to the room and returned a short time later looking puzzled. My mother knew he wouldn't find anything because it had been completely empty since they had moved in. There was no explanation for that loud thumping noise, and that put my parents on edge. Secretly, my father did not want to accept that he was scared. Another curious noise my parents frequently heard was described as a dragging of a large piece of rawhide. This description continues to intrigue me, as I also heard this from a Mexican podcast that interviews people who have experienced hauntings. A lady described it word by word as a dragging of a piece of rawhide. The most terrifying experience happened to my mother one day when my father was out working the farm. My mother was busy tending to her chores when she saw a woman descending slowly down the steps from the storage room. My mother watched in horror as she came down, her feet not touching any of the steps. My mother was frozen in terror and lost it when the woman reached the bottom step. The apparition lifted her arm to point and opened her mouth as if trying to speak. The next thing my mother remembers is waking up on the floor to my father's shocked expression. She explained to him what she saw, and he was speechless. After this, my mother no longer stayed on her own in the home and would help my father with his chores on the farm. There were more noises and experiences to follow, but she never saw that apparition again. The final straw for my parents was on the occasion of my second brother's birth. He was about a month old, and my mother had left him bundled up on the bed and had gone out to help harvest that year's corn. When she came to check on the baby, she was taken aback to find him half on the bed and half off. It looked as if something had pulled him towards the edge. It was not possible for a bound-up month-old baby to have moved himself. For my mother, that was enough. After the apparition of a woman and her baby being moved, she was afraid of harm, and she insisted that they leave, which they did. I don't know if that house is still standing. It was a single home on a ranch, and it was far from any other homestead. That haunted home may be forgotten, but as for my mother, she will never forget. Alberto Sandoval, Central Valley, California. Incredible storytelling, Alberto. I decided to do a bit of research on the history of La Llorona that you had mentioned. In Latin folklore, the Weeping Woman is one of the most famous oral legends. The saga is said that in a rural village there lived a young woman named Maria. She came from a poor family, but was known around her village for her beauty. One day, an extremely wealthy nobleman traveled through her village. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Maria. Maria was charmed by him, and he was taken aback by her beauty. So when he proposed to her, she immediately accepted. Maria's family was thrilled that she was marrying into a wealthy family, but the nobleman's father was extremely disappointed that his son was marrying into poverty. Maria and her new husband built a house in the village to be away from his disapproving father. Eventually, she gave birth to 2 sons. Her husband was always traveling and began to stop spending time with his family. When he came home, he only paid attention to his sons, and as time passed, Maria could tell that her husband was falling out of love with her because she was getting old. One day he returned to the village with a younger woman and told his sons farewell, totally ignoring Maria. Maria, angry and hurt, took her children to the river and drowned them in a blind rage. She realized what she had done and began searching for them, but the river had already carried them away. Days later, she was found dead on the riverbank. She had committed the two ultimate sins, murder and suicide. Challenged at the gates of heaven for the whereabouts of her children, she was not permitted to enter the afterlife until she found them. Stuck between the land of the living and the dead, she spends eternity looking for her lost children. She's always heard weeping for her children, earning her the name La Llorona, the Weeping Woman. It is said that if you hear her crying, you are to run in the opposite way. If you hear her cries, they could bring you misfortune or even death. Many parents in Latin America use this story to scare their children from staying out too late. The weeping woman kidnaps wandering children at night, mistaking them for her own. She begs the heavens for forgiveness and drowns the children that she kidnaps. People who claim to have seen her say that she appears at night or in late evening by rivers or lakes, wearing a white or black gown with a veil. Some believe that those who hear the wails of La Llorona are marked for death or misfortune, similar to the Gaelic banshee. Among her wails, she is noted as crying, Ay mi Jesus, which translates to, O my children. Well, that is the story, and again I want to thank Alberto for sending his in. Do you have a story that you want to tell on the show? If you do, we want to hear it. It can be about any subject and from any genre. Heck, it doesn't even have to be true. Original fiction or stories from the public domain are quite welcome. To submit them, just head to ronsamazingstories.com and click on the Story Submissions banner. Fill out the form, and soon your story will be heard. Do you have a story but don't want to write it? That's okay too. Just leave your contact information, a brief description of your story, and I'll get back to you. We can write it together. However, if you don't do it, your story remains just that, your story. Why not make it our story? Back in January of 2016, I met an Undertaker for the first time. No, there was nothing wrong. Nobody died, and it was a really good experience. You see, author Stanley Swan is a retired Undertaker who wrote about his adventures during his 30-plus years of service in the funeral business. Stan is back with us today to talk about his new book, Tales Unleashed. Knowing as a youngster that he would become an Undertaker, Stanley has always been fascinated by tales of the unknown and the unusual. He grew up in the 50s and 60s watching science fiction and reading stories by the legends like Alfred Hitchcock and Rod Serling. After spending 35 years in the funeral business, Stan wrote his first book, Undertakings of an Undertaker. In his new book, Tales Unleashed, you'll experience the chill of a fortune teller, a pumpkin weeping for home, a crow who stands guard over his domain, and being lost at a drive-in. There are 28 stories in all, and they are all just that good. I want to welcome to the show, for the second time, author and retired Undertaker, Stanley Swan. Welcome to the podcast, Stan.
Thank you, Ron. It's great to be back on the podcast with you. I think it's been a year and a half or two since I was on before, and I'm excited about chatting with you and your audience again today.
Well, when I heard that your book was out, I couldn't not have you because you are a storyteller. Am I right?
Yeah, I have always enjoyed good stories, Ron, and as a youngster, I did a little writing, but I did quite a bit of reading of short stories. And two of my favorite authors were, well, this will show you my age. These go back a few decades. A couple of my favorite writers were Alfred Hitchcock and Rod Serling. I enjoyed everything that they wrote, produced, movies, etc. And I've always enjoyed a good short story read. I read a few novels, but I like the short stories. I like them the best.
So, Stan, tell us about this book. I know the title of it is Tales Unleashed, so I'm guessing it's a collection of short stories.
Yeah, you're right on the money, Ron. It is a collection. There are 28 short stories. They're all fiction. There's a little bit of everything in Tales Unleashed. There's a couple of stories about time travel, both going ahead in time and going back in time. There's a story about a UFO encounter with a young couple who actually retain actual proof of their encounter after it happens. There's a couple of disappearance stories in there. A girl's entrance to what I call the second level after a car crash that she's involved with. A young girl who's ice skating encounters a face under the ice, and that's a pretty intriguing little story. Mm-hmm. There's a couple of stories about drive-in movies. There aren't too many drive-in movies around the country that are still open, but I have a couple of stories about drive-in movies. There's a fortune teller's marble. I'm going to read that story a little bit later. A story about a woman who buys a retirement home for herself after a startling discovery in the basement while she's being shown the house. And a widow receives a letter decades after her husband is lost in the war, but it comes to her in a most unusual fashion. And those are just some of the highlights of some of the stories that are in Tales Unleashed.
One of the things I noticed right away, and you've already mentioned your interest in Rod Serling, was that these stories, all of them, had a feel of his famous show, Night Gallery. I just wanted you to know that. I thought that was something pretty special, and it really, really makes the book feel like you're watching episodes of that show.
That's a great compliment, Ron. I thank you so much for that. Yeah, Rod Serling was a big force in some of my writing. I think I've read most of the things he ever wrote. I just put on my writing blog a story about visiting. Rod Serling is buried about 60 miles from where I live here in New York State. I visited his grave last fall, and I've written a nice story, and there's some nice pictures about that on my writing blog, and we'll give that address out before we leave your podcast tonight. But yeah, he was a big influence, along with Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock was, to me, a real great when it came to writing stories, and Alfred Hitchcock always kind of left you out at the end of the story wanting more. Like,
yes, he did.
He finished all. You know what I'm talking about? Mm-hmm. You know, you watch Alfred Hitchcock presents or some of his stories on television, and all of a sudden he's done, and I'm going, that's the end of it? You always wanted more. So they were great writers, and I thank you so much for the compliment. I really do.
Well, locally here, we get Alfred Hitchcock on his shows repeated a lot. And if I can, I watch him. That's how much I love the guy. Anything he did, even his movies, are just out of this world good stuff. You can't go wrong with Alfred Hitchcock.
Yeah, his movies, North by Northwest and Rear Window and The Birds. One of my favorites was The Birds. Great movie. Mm-hmm. Vertigo, and of course, Psycho. Probably his most famous movie. And he just had some tremendous stuff. And a lot of things most people don't know about Alfred Hitchcock. He made a cameo appearance in all of his movies. Did you know that?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. You'll see him somewhere, and most people don't recognize him. He'll be in a disguise or standing on the street or walking through the scene, but he had an appearance. And it was kind of neat to see the actual writer in the movie himself. Not playing a part, but just maybe a walkthrough.
I'm sure you've heard the name Stan Lee from Marvel Comics. He did that for the same reason that Hitchcock did. He wanted to be part of the story. So yeah, and I think that makes it makes it a little more special. It does.
For the writers and for readers and for viewers to see. Well, and Stephen King has done that in many of his movies. He's had a cameo appearance in a disguise or whatever, and so that it makes it kind of special. It really does.
It does. So tell us about how you came about with these stories. Are they all original, or did you take them from life experience or whatnot? How did that come about?
The stories in Tales Unleashed, and as I say, there's 28 of them. They're all short stories, and they're all fiction, with the exception of maybe a couple ideas that I had as I start thinking about what to write about. I maybe flash back to a time when I was a kid, and the one story I'm going to read for you shortly goes back to a time when I was a kid, maybe in 5th or 6th grade, where we would, as a project, go through a popular science magazine and answer an ad for free this or that by sending a quarter through the mail. Well, a lot of kids did that. It was fun. And the story I'm going to read tonight was taken from that, flashback to me that I did that when I was a kid, and I'll write a story about it. And a lot of the stories, there are three cemetery-related stories in Tales Unleashed. And, of course, the cemetery stories come from the time when I spent almost 4 decades in the funeral business, so it was easy to come up with 2 or 3 stories about cemeteries. And I think they're quite enchanting. And then lots of times, Ron, I'll just be out. My best ideas for a story come just going out and driving on a country road, stopping at an old farmhouse, walking through an abandoned property, seeing an old abandoned truck or car or tractor out in the field, sitting down with my notebook, and just stories will come to me. I'll say, this is a great location, great things to maybe write about. And then I'll make notes and come back to my writing hut here and sit down and write. I kind of liken myself to you remember Jack Nicholson in The Shining at the Overlook?
Oh dear, yes I do.
The place that I write at, I have an A-frame here in New York State on a little place called Loon Lake, and I kind of resembles the Overlook in the wintertime.
Well, I hope you don't go busting through doors saying, "Here's Stanley."
No, I haven't gone off the deep end yet. I don't think I will. My mental health is pretty good. So, but I kind of think about Jack writing at the Overlook when I do some of my writing.
One of the stories that I really have to ask about and that I really enjoyed was Harry's Lost Airplane. Is there any truth to that story?
The true part of that story is I was and still am a radio-controlled airplane flyer. I was a member of a radio-controlled group in Phelps, New York, which is southeast of Rochester. Still a member there, not flying anymore. But we had one of our longtime original members, first name was Harry, and he was quite the character. And I thought, I need to write a story about RC Airplane. That's how that story came about. Yeah, it's a fiction story, but I had Harry in mind when I wrote the story.
Well, I got to say, that particular story, I don't know why, but it spoke to me somehow. I've never flown airplanes or not, but one of the things that I did do, there's a place here in town that people fly planes, and I would go and sit and watch them fly them, and it is fascinating stuff watching them do that.
Yeah, radio-controlled flying is it's a terrific hobby for any age. We had people in our club who are father and sons or are-day father and daughters, and it can be a great family sport, radio-controlled flying. Of course, now the big thing is the drones, everybody's flying a drone now.
Yeah, with some detrimental effects, I might add.
Yes, yep. Some interesting. With the ages have really moved along quickly. There's so many days that I feel like a dinosaur.
Yeah. Well, you said that you were going to read a story for us. What do you say we do that right now?
All right, I will. I have the book in front of me, and I'm going to turn to page 60. This is story number 16. It's called The Fortune Teller's Marble. The marble was very unique. It had come home to the family farmhouse inside of Terry's metal lunchbox in the spring of 1962. As his mother opened the lunchbox to remove the papers left from Terry's noontime lunch, a small piece of glass rolled out, hit the counter and bounced to the floor, rolling another 10 feet to strike the frame of the cellar door, which blocked its further escape. Reaching down and picking up the marble, Terry's mother examined it closely. It was exquisite and very unique. She had never seen one quite like it before. The marble was cloudy and almost milky in color, but had a magnificent turquoise shape that appeared to be floating within the cloud. Terry, his mom yelled, "Come to the kitchen, please." She heard his footsteps descend from his room, into the cloak area at the bottom of the stairs and then into the kitchen. Yes, Mom, what do you need? Where did you get this marble? She held it between her thumb and forefinger. Does it belong to somebody at school? Terry snatched the marble and replied, Oh, there it is. I thought I'd lost it for a minute. Oh, I traded my little sailboat I used to put in the creek for the marble with Jimmy Taylor. You know Jimmy. And he was okay with that? His mom raised an eyebrow. Seems a little lopsided to me. You worked a long time to make that boat. Yeah, maybe, but this marble is special. He said it came from a fortune teller ad in a magazine. He sent away for it. It cost 50 cents. But he said he didn't bring him any good luck, so he wanted to get rid of it. Trade it away. By this point, his mother had one hand on her hip and looked a little disgusted. Well, she said, so far it's not brought you any good luck. You had time and money in that little boat you built. Seems to me you got the short end of the stick. Oh, it's okay, Mom. I got a feeling about this marble. And with that, Terry tucked the marble in his jeans pocket and disappeared out the back door before his mom could get another word out. The next few weeks around the farmhouse were rather perplexing. Terry's father fell off a short ladder in the house, while Terry sat nearby rolling the marble against dominoes set up in its path. 10 days later, while taking a hot pan off the stove, Terry's mom burned her left hand as Terry sat on the floor behind her, shooting the turquoise gem into a paper cup laid on its side. 3 days after that, Terry was sent to the office for disrupting his class. Mesmerized by the marble, Terry would sit at the wood-top desk and lightly bounce it an inch or two from the desk into his hand, back and forth. But the worst was yet to come. 6 weeks after the marble came home in the lunchbox, his grandfather, who had come for his mom's famous pancakes, fell at the house, breaking his right leg. At his feet came out from under him. His foot kicked a small piece of glass against the dining room wall. Yup, the turquoise marble. Terry had been right when he told his mom he had a feeling about the marble. It was special, but it brought nothing but bad luck to his family, and Terry knew he had one thing to do to end it. On a bright sunny afternoon, Terry took the marble out to the back porch. With all his strength, threw the marble as far as his little arm could muster. It was gone. Where was it? Did that piece of turquoise glass have some power not known to Terry or to anyone else who'd been around it? The answer would come a short time later. Circumstances for Terry's family continued on the downward spiral. His father lost his job at the railroad, and there was no work nearby, so the family decided to sell the house and head back towards Philadelphia to be close to the rest of the family. It was an agonizing decision for them, but with little choice left, they decided the move was best for everyone. The house sat empty for almost 2 years while real estate agents were earnest to sell the house. During that time, it inevitably showed the signs of being empty. On a chilly day in October the following year, while readying the house to show later that day, real estate agent Judy Dwyer climbed the steps of the house to what was once Terry's room on the second floor. Her eyes peering into the brightly lit room, she noticed a reflection of light on the windowsill. Walking over to the window, she reached down and picked up a wonderful little piece of glass with turquoise floating in a cloud. At first, she thought it would be a nice little present for her daughter, but she reconsidered and replaced the marble on the white window frame. Best leave things as they are. That was the right thing to do. Terry's marble had been tossed far away, but it had found its home again. Now the marble that had been brought through the mail from a fortune teller's ad would soon have a new family from which to garner some attention. After all, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And that is a fortune teller's marble.
That is a great story. That is a good one. I enjoyed that. Thank you for reading that for us.
Thank you very much. I hope your audience will enjoy it as well.
Well, it is Ron's Amazing Stories, so I'm pretty sure they will. Again, it has that night gallery feel again. You just can't deny it.
Thank you again for the compliment. And I've listened to some of the other guests that you have in your program. You have a very distinct program, and I've enjoyed the podcast that I have had time to listen to.
Well, thank you for that.
You do a nice job interviewing.
Well, let's talk about how people can find your book.
Okay, I'm going to give out my email first. I love hearing from people who write me for any reason. My email address is That goes back to my first book, Undertakings. My email address is undertakings, plural, @inbox.com. My writing blog is my undertakings, plural, myundertakings.blogspot.com. myundertakings.blogspot.com. Just before we started tonight, I went to my site and reinstituted the story I wrote a year ago about visiting the death place where Rod Serling is buried here in Interlake, New York. That story is with some nice pictures that I took are on my blog. I've got some writings, general interest I do on my Undertakings blog. A little bit of everything. I think people enjoy visiting there.
Well, I want to thank you for taking some time and sharing stories with us. I will have all of those links in the show notes for people to have. So, Stanley, I want to thank you so much for coming back. The first time you were on the show, we did talk about Undertakings of an Undertaker, and this time we talked about Tales Unleashed, and I happen to know that both of those books are available on Amazon.
Thank you, Ron, very much for having me back on. I wish all your listeners to Ron's amazing stories. I wish them health, wealth, and prosperity.
Well, that was a whole lot of fun to chat with Stan, and I want to thank him for being on the program today. Also for his patience. He contacted me some time ago about Tales Unleashed and had to wait quite a while before we could get him on. I will have all of the links that Stan spoke about in this week's show notes. Now, do go visit his blog and remember that both of his books, Undertakings of an Undertaker and Tales Unleashed, are available on Amazon. Our featured story this time comes from the 1950 pulp magazines. I've been asked a lot how I find these stories. The answer comes in two parts. My first stop is to go to the Project Gutenberg and search through their archives. They have over 59,000 ebooks and short stories. It is an amazing place, and everything there is guaranteed to be free and in the public domain. You'd be surprised by what's there. After I have found something, I head on over to LibriVox.org to find out if somebody's already recorded it. If not, I find someone to read it or I do it myself. That's it. This time we have a science fiction short called Spacemen Never Die by Morris Hirschman. This is quite unique and tells us much about ourselves and our future, from the viewpoint of the 1950s, that is. It is read for us by Dale Grothman. Henry knew his wife had been married once before. Now he expected her to start a new life with him. But to her, the past was alive and spacemen never die.
Henry Weller stood facing a huge, three-dimensional picture on the wall of his dining room. "Can't we get rid of it?" he asked, turning to his wife. "I mean, with all due respect, of course." No man enjoys coming into his dining room and having to sit at meals and look at a full-size picture of his wife's first husband arriving on Venus. Fair's fair, but such a setup is ridiculous. "No!" Phoebe shook her blonde head. "Don Menton loved me, and he was famous. I like to be reminded of the days when my picture was on all the telepapers, and my face on so many telescreens." She might just as well have called him a tattered nonentity, though Henry was doing pretty well as a foreman of the local humanoid factory. He was stopped from reminding her by Phoebe saying she'd leave for a bit of shopping. She left abruptly. Henry watched her take off from the roof of their two-story fibroid house and went back to the dining room. Now, even his warmest admirers would give in that he had a streak of stubbornness in him 1 mile wide and 6 miles deep. Henry took the three-dimensional monstrosity off the wall, holding it hard by thumb and forefinger on its Luminex frame, and prepared to say goodbye to the picture. A foreman at one of the humanoid shops has to be able to consider alternatives, and Henry had done this. If he only hid the picture, there'd be a domestic crisis and the picture would sooner or later be back on the wall. If he destroyed it, there'd also be a crisis, but one that would eventually blow over. Unluckily for him, these three-dimensional wall pictures were made out of glassine, and when he tried to set fire to it, he nearly burned down the house. Upon feeding it into the old-fashioned fireplace, nothing grew hot except his temper. Ripping the picture to shreds would have been the next step, but you can't rip glassine. For maybe the 6 millionth time, he cursed out Don Manton, the well-known explorer in the realm of outer space. Henry understood, in a general way, that Don Manton had been among the first to chart the cities of Mars and Venus, and had accidentally died on a planet named Immel, but Henry had no intention of living in Don Manton's shadow. The picture, which showed the late explorer talking to 3 Venusians, had been hung up again when Phoebe came through the ceiling door along the extension stairway, which flicked up to meet her. "You've been trying to get rid of Don's picture." He hung it crookedly, and the diagonal slash of the white wallpaper had given him away. "Just this one. You've got cans of telefilm in the cellar, but them I don't mind. This," he flicked it with a thumbnail, "I do mind." "As long as I stay," Phoebe said quietly, "my darling Don's picture stays." "But what about your darling Henry? Am I just a humanoid who looks and behaves and talks like a human being? Haven't I got feelings?" Henry strode around the room, hitting the fibroid floor like a prehistoric monster on a sandpaper bridge. "Either the picture goes," he said finally, definitely, "or I go." Phoebe shook out her blonde hair, letting it fall about her shoulders. "Too bad." Inside an hour, he had packed his suitcases. Phoebe cried bitterly, but wouldn't budge about the picture. He put up at his club and went to the bar, and was gobbling down something called pressurized scotch when he heard a noise back of him. "Get away from me," said Henry, who was quite a few over the traditional 8 by this time. "I've had enough of Don Manton, let alone his helpers." Steve Rogues had taken a couple of trips with Manton, was tall and thin as a bar stool, and with a spaceman's ability to think fast when he had to. Loudly, he ordered a Venus whiz, explaining to the disgusted Henry, "After the barkeep mixes the drinks, he melts the swizzle stick and pours it in, too." He gulped the stuff down gratefully and then said, "Tell me your troubles, Hank." Henry did. Speed Rogues looked disgusted. "Are you serious?" he asked, and when Henry swore to cut Speed's throat on asking that again, went on, "Women are space mad." As Henry agreed, Rogue said, "The one thing you don't understand about Don Manton is that he was maladjusted. He couldn't stay still. He always wanted what he couldn't have. That goes for his feelings for women, too." Henry looked up with bloodshot eyes that nearly popped out of his head. Rogues kept going. "Don and Phoebe never got along once they got married. It was Manton's fault. Like all explorers, he was unhappy over his lot and looked beyond the rainbow. In fact, he told me once that the only reason he went in for exploring space was to get away from his wife." Henry Weller suddenly rocked with laughter. He got to his feet, took Rogues, and went to his room, still laughing. He lay on the bed for half an hour. At the end of that time, he sat up. "Tell the manager I won't be here for supper," he said to Speed. "I've got a little trip to make." "Where are you going?" "Home, to give the good tidings to my wife." Henry's fibroid house looked about the same. He parked the plane and let himself in by the roof door and down the extension staircase. He found Phoebe in the kitchen, bent over a pot, and at sound of him she turned. A near smile flickered in her blue eyes. "Phoebe." "Henry." They laughed together. Henry wanted to tell her what he knew as bitterly and maliciously as possible, but he simply opened his mouth a few times. He didn't say it. Everyone is entitled to an illusion, and this was Phoebe, his blonde wench, his wife, his woman. He looked a bit sick. Phoebe smiled. "Come into the dining room." The three-dimensional picture had been rolled up into the corner. Henry promised to put it away in the cellar and clean up the cellar as soon as he could. Phoebe said that her first husband never liked to stay home. He'd always been afraid to live normally. "I was wrong about the picture," she told him, "and I didn't know till I saw you leave the house." It goes without saying that Henry and his Phoebe lived happily ever after, but it is perhaps not too well known that Phoebe was left with a little disposal problem, too. She had a rough time finding a buyer, in secret of course, for her brand new humanoid, who looked and behaved and talked so exactly like the well-known flyer, Speed Rogues. The end of Spacemen Never Die by Morris Hirschman.
Did you like that? I found myself hanging on to every word, even though there was very little action. A true story of love and admiration. Spacemen Never Die was first published in Imagination Stories of Science and Fantasy, August 1953. I wasn't able to find out much about its author, Morris Hirschman, and I suspect that it was probably an alias.
Hi everyone, I am Jason Dowd, president of Gladys Goodies, and Gladys is my dachshund, and I am excited to tell you that if you go to our website, GladysGoodies.com, and use the promo code RONS, that's RONS, you will get 25% off your entire order. These treats are all natural with low fat, no artificial flavors, chemicals, byproducts, preservatives, sodium, or anything else that will harm your fur friend. We take great pride in our products, and you will see it once you try some. So go to GladysGoodies.com, that's GladysGoodies.com, and don't forget to use the promo code RON to get that discount. And while you're there, pick your doggy up some swag too. You'll be glad you did, and thanks for listening to this amazing podcast of Ron's Amazing Stories.
That is the show for this time. I want to thank Alberto Sandoval, Stanley Swan, and Dale Groffman for taking part. You guys made all of this happen. If you want to follow the podcast or the blog, just head to ronsamazingstories.com. There you will find all of the links that should fit every need. If you want to help the show, the best thing that you can do is tell your friends all about it. And please leave reviews or feedback wherever you listen. This really does, as you can see from the numbers, help us to grow. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.